A beggar took care of an elderly man after his family abandoned him and was surprised to see what he was hiding. The crisp autumn air nipped at Zane Holloway's exposed skin as he trudged through Oak Ridge Park, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. At 27, Zane had been living on the streets of Millbrook, Oregon for the better part of 3 years. Life hadn't been kind to him, but he'd learned to survive, to find beauty in the small things, like the way the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, or the satisfying crunch of fallen leaves beneath his feet. As he made his way along the winding path, a figure on a nearby bench caught his eye. An elderly man sat hunched over, his silver hair disheveled and his clothes rumpled. Something about the man's demeanor struck Zane as off. He'd seen his fair share of park dwellers, but this one seemed different, lost, confused, and utterly out of place. Zane hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Excuse me, sir, are you all right?" The old man looked up, his blue eyes clouded with confusion. I'm not sure. Where am I?" Zane's brow furrowed with concern. "You're in Oak Ridge Park in Millbrook. Do you know how you got here?" The man shook his head slowly, his gaze unfocused. "I can't remember. I don't know where I am or who I am." His voice trembled and Zane felt a pang of sympathy. "It's okay. Take it easy," Zane said, sitting down beside him. "My name's Zane. What's the last thing you do remember?" The old man's forehead creased as he struggled to recall. I was walking. There were trees. And then nothing. It's all a blur." Zane glanced around the park, hoping to spot someone who might know the man, but the area was nearly deserted as dusk settled in. He couldn't just leave this confused stranger alone, especially with night approaching. "Listen," Zane said, making a decision he hoped he wouldn't regret. "I know we just met, but I've got a place nearby where you can rest for the night. It's not much, but it's safe and dry. Maybe after some sleep your memory will start to come back." The old man looked at Zane with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "You'd do that for a stranger?" Zane shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "We're all strangers until we meet, right? Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." As they stood, the man swayed slightly and Zane quickly steadied him. "Easy there. Here, lean on me if you need to." Together they made their way out of the park and through the quiet streets of Millbrook. Zane led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, one he'd been calling home for the past few months. He'd managed to create a cozy corner with salvaged furniture and plenty of blankets. "It's not the Ritz," Zane said as they entered, "but it keeps the rain out and the drafts to a minimum." The old man looked around with wide eyes, taking in the makeshift living space. "This is remarkable. You've made quite a home here." Zane felt a surge of pride at the compliment. "Thanks. I do what I can. Here, why don't you take the cot? I've got some extra blankets you can use." As he helped the man get settled, Zane couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, the shape of his nose, the set of his jaw. It tugged at some distant memory, but Zane couldn't quite place it. "I wish I could remember my name," the old man said softly as he sat on the edge of the cot. "It feels strange to be nameless." Zane thought for a moment. "Well, we've got to call you something. How about Arthur? You look like an Arthur to me." The man nodded, a small smile appearing on his weathered face. "Arthur? Yes. I suppose that will do for now. Thank you, Zane. For everything." As Zane settled into his own makeshift bed on the floor, he found himself wondering about the mysterious Arthur. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why did Zane feel such a strong connection to this stranger? Little did he know, the answers to these questions would shake the very foundation of his world. The next morning, Zane awoke to the sound of quiet muttering. He opened his eyes to see Arthur sitting up on the cot, his brow furrowed in concentration as he stared at his hands. "Arthur, you okay?" Zane asked, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The old man looked up, startled. "Oh, Zane. Good morning. I think I remembered something. Just a fragment, really. There was a house, a blue house with white trim, and a maple tree in the front yard." Zane felt a glimmer of hope. "That's great. Maybe it's where you lived." Do you remember anything else about it? The street name or the town? Arthur shook his head, frustration evident in his eyes. No, it's all still so foggy. But I can see that house clear as day. As they shared a simple breakfast of granola bars and bottled water, Zane couldn't help but study Arthur's face. In the light of day, that nagging sense of familiarity grew stronger. There was something about the way Arthur's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the timbre of his voice. It all struck a chord deep within Zane. So, Arthur, Zane began, trying to piece together more of the puzzle. Can you remember anything about your family? Do you think you have kids or grandkids who might be looking for you? A shadow passed over Arthur's face. I'm not sure. There's a feeling, like an ache in my chest when I try to think about family, but I can't grasp any specific memories. Zane nodded sympathetically. That's okay. These things can take time. Maybe we should take a walk around town, see if anything jogs your memory. As they strolled through the streets of Millbrook, Zane pointed out local landmarks and shared bits of the town's history. Arthur listened intently, his eyes darting from building to building as if searching for a hint of recognition. They paused in front of the Millbrook Public Library, its grand stone facade imposing against the clear blue sky. Arthur's gaze lingered on the building, a spark of interest in his eyes. You know, Zane said, they've got old newspapers and local records in there. Maybe we could do some digging, see if we can find any clues about where you came from. Arthur nodded eagerly. Yes, that sounds like a good idea. I may not remember who I am, but perhaps there's a paper trail that could lead us somewhere. Inside the library, Zane helped Arthur navigate the microfiche machine, scrolling through years of local newspapers. As they searched, Zane couldn't help but feel a growing connection to the older man. There was something comforting about Arthur's presence, a sense of belonging that Zane hadn't felt in years. Hours passed as they pored over old articles and records. Just as they were about to call it a day, Arthur let out a gasp. Wait, go back, please. Zane rewound the microfiche, stopping on a page from a newspaper dated 25 years ago. There, in a small article near the bottom of the page, was a familiar face. A younger version of Arthur standing next to a woman and a small boy. The headline read, Local Family Wins Community Garden Award. Arthur's hands trembled as he leaned closer to the screen. That's me. And that woman, she must be my wife. And the boy... Zane felt his heart racing as he read the caption beneath the photo. Garrett and Elaine Holloway with their son Zane, age 2. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications sank in. Zane stared at the image of the little boy, recognizing his own features, then looked back at Arthur, at Garrett, his father. It can't be, Zane whispered, his voice barely audible. Dad? Arthur, Garrett, turned to look at Zane, his eyes widening with a mix of recognition and disbelief. Zane? My God, is it really you? The floodgates of memory seemed to burst open for Garrett in that moment. I remember now. Zane, my boy, I left. There was an accident, your mother. Oh, what have I done? Zane felt a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion, and a desperate longing he'd buried years ago. You left us. I was just a kid, and you disappeared. Why? How could you just forget about your own son? Garrett's face crumpled with shame and regret. I didn't forget, Zane, I ran. After your mother died, I couldn't handle the grief, the responsibility. I convinced myself you'd be better off without me. I've spent years trying to forget, to numb the pain, and now, I've literally forgotten everything. The weight of the revelation settled over them both. Zane, the homeless young man who'd taken in a stranger out of kindness, had unknowingly rescued his long-lost father. And Garrett, the man who'd abandoned his family, was now dependent on the son he'd left behind. As they left the library, both men were lost in thought, grappling with the incredible twist of fate that had brought them back together. The streets of Millbrook seemed different now, charged with the electricity of their shared past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Back at the warehouse, Zane paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. I don't know how to process this. For years I've wondered about you, imagined what I'd say if I ever saw you again. And now here you are, and I don't know whether to hug you or hate you." Garrett sat on the cot, his shoulders slumped. "I deserve your hatred, Zane. What I did was unforgivable. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my weakness." Zane stopped pacing and looked at his father, this man who was both stranger and family. "What happened after you left? Where have you been all these years?" Garrett shook his head, his memories still fragmented. "It's all a blur. I remember drinking a lot, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long. I think I was trying to outrun my guilt, my shame, and somewhere along the way I must have hit my head or maybe my mind just couldn't take it anymore. That's how you found me, a blank slate." The irony wasn't lost on Zane. He'd spent years trying to forget the pain of abandonment, while his father had literally forgotten everything. Now they were both adrift, clinging to each other in a sea of lost memories and missed opportunities. As night fell, father and son sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. In the days that followed, Zane and Garrett fell into an uneasy routine. They spent their mornings at the library, piecing together the fragments of Garrett's past through old records and newspapers. In the afternoons, they walked the streets of Millbrook, with Garrett pointing out places that stirred faint memories and Zane filling in the blanks of the years they'd spent apart. It was during one of these walks that Garrett suddenly stopped in front of a small, weathered house with peeling blue paint and overgrown shrubs in the yard. His eyes widened with recognition. This is it," he whispered. "The house I remembered. We lived here, Zane. This was our home." Zane stared at the dilapidated structure, a flood of childhood memories rushing back. "I remember now. The tire swing in the backyard, Mom's flower garden." His voice trailed off as he thought of his mother, Elaine. The pain of her loss, compounded by his father's abandonment, had shaped so much of his life. He turned to Garrett, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Tell me about the accident," Zane said quietly. "What happened to Mom?" Garrett's face contorted with grief and guilt. "It was a rainy night. We'd been arguing, about money, about my drinking. I stormed out, drove to a bar. When I came home, there were police cars everywhere. They told me Elaine had gone out looking for me. She skidded off the road. They said she died instantly." Zane felt a surge of anger. "So it was your fault. If you hadn't been out drinking—" "You're right," Garrett interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "It was my fault. I couldn't face what I'd done, couldn't bear to look at you and see her eyes staring back at me. So I ran. God help me. I ran from my own child." The weight of the confession hung heavy between them. Zane wanted to lash out, to make his father feel the pain of all those years of abandonment. But looking at Garrett now, this broken, remorseful old man, Zane realized that his father had been punishing himself far more effectively than Zane ever could. "What happened to you after that?" Zane asked, his voice softer now. "How did you end up back here in Millbrook?" Garrett shook his head, frustration evident in his features. "I wish I could tell you. The last clear memory I have is deciding to come back to try and make amends. I remember boarding a bus, but after that, nothing. Until you found me in the park." As they stood there, looking at the ghost of their former home, an elderly woman emerged from the house next door. She squinted at them suspiciously before her eyes widened in recognition. "Garrett? Garrett Holloway, is that you?" she called out, making her way slowly down her front walk. Garrett turned, confusion giving way to a glimmer of recognition. "Mrs. Abernathy? You still live here?" The old woman nodded, her gaze shifting between Garrett and Zane. "Never left. Unlike some people. And this must be little Zane all grown up. My, how time flies." Zane stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy. I'm afraid I don't remember much from when we lived here." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened. "No, I suppose you wouldn't. You were just a little thing when all the trouble happened. Such a shame about your mother. She was a lovely woman." An awkward silence fell over the group. Garrett cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Abernathy, I owe you an apology. The way I left, not saying goodbye, the old woman held up a hand, cutting him off. Save your apologies, Garrett. What's done is done. The question is, what are you doing back here now? Before Garrett could respond, Zane jumped in. It's a long story, Mrs. Abernathy. My father's been unwell. He's had some memory problems. We're trying to piece things together. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed shrewdly. Memory problems, eh? Well, I suppose that's convenient. Lets you forget all the pain you caused, doesn't it, Garrett? Garrett flinched at her words, but Zane felt a surge of protectiveness. Despite everything, this was still his father. We're working through things, Mrs. Abernathy. It's complicated. The old woman sniffed disapprovingly but seemed to sense it was time to back off. Well, I suppose everyone deserves a second chance, even those who don't seem to appreciate their first one. You boys take care now. As Mrs. Abernathy retreated to her house, Zane and Garrett stood in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Finally, Zane spoke. Come on, Dad. Let's head back. I think we've had enough memory lane for one day. Garrett nodded, relief evident in his eyes. As they walked away from their old neighborhood, Zane couldn't help but feel like they were leaving more than just a house behind. They were leaving the ghosts of their past, stepping into an uncertain future together. Back at the warehouse, Zane busied himself making a meager dinner while Garrett sat lost in thought. The encounter with Mrs. Abernathy had stirred up a whirlwind of emotions for both of them. As they ate their simple meal of canned soup and crackers, Garrett broke the silence. Zane, I know I have no right to ask this, but what happened to you after I left? How did you end up? He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. Zane set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone. It wasn't easy, Dad. After you disappeared, I bounced around the foster care system for a while. Some homes were okay, others, not so much. When I aged out at 18, I was pretty lost. Tried college for a bit but couldn't afford it. Worked odd jobs but nothing ever stuck. He paused, running a hand through his hair. About 3 years ago, I lost my job and couldn't make rent. Ended up on the streets. Been trying to get back on my feet ever since, but it's not easy when you don't have an address or a phone number. Garrett listened, his face a mask of guilt and sorrow. I had no idea. Zane, I'm so sorry. If I had been there. But you weren't, Zane cut in, his voice sharp. You weren't there, and I had to figure it out on my own. And you know what? I did. I survived. I'm still here. Garrett nodded, tears welling in his eyes. You're right, you're stronger than I ever was, stronger than I am now. Zane felt his anger deflate, replaced by a weariness that seemed to seep into his bones. Look, Dad, I'm not going to pretend that everything's okay between us. There's a lot of hurt, a lot of lost time. But you're here now, and maybe that counts for something. A glimmer of hope appeared in Garrett's eyes. Does that mean, do you think we could try to start over? To build some kind of relationship? Zane was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, he spoke. I think we can try, but it's going to take time. And work. A lot of work. Garrett nodded eagerly. I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I've been given a second chance, and I don't intend to waste it. As they cleared away the remnants of their meal, a new sense of purpose seemed to fill the air. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by fate, but a father and son, tentatively reaching out to bridge the chasm between them. That night, as Zane lay on his makeshift bed, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. With his father back in his life, maybe there was hope for something better. Maybe they could help each other heal, find their way back to solid ground. Little did he know the journey ahead would test their newfound bond in ways neither of them could have imagined. The following weeks brought a gradual shift in the dynamic between Zane and Garrett. As Garrett's memories continued to resurface, they spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of their shared history. Some conversations were painful, reopening old wounds, while others brought laughter and a growing sense of connection. One crisp morning, as they walked through the park where they had first met, Garrett suddenly stopped, his face pale. Zane, I think I remember something. About why I came back to Millbrook. Zane turned to his father, concern etched on his face. What is it, Dad? Garrett's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. There was a letter. From your mother's sister. Your Aunt Cordelia. She wrote that she had something important to tell me. Something about Elaine. That's why I decided to come back after all these years. Zane's mind raced. He had vague memories of his Aunt Cordelia, a stern woman who had never approved of his father. Do you remember what she wanted to tell you? Garrett shook his head, frustration evident in his features. No, that's all I can recall. But Zane, if Cordelia had information about your mother, don't you think we should try to find her? The idea of delving further into his family's past made Zane uneasy, but he couldn't deny his curiosity. I suppose we could try. But Dad, I haven't seen or heard from Aunt Cordelia since I was a kid. I don't even know if she still lives in Millbrook. They decided to start their search at the library, combing through local records and directories. After hours of fruitless searching, they were about to give up when Zane stumbled upon a small notice in a recent newspaper. Dad, look at this, he said, pointing to the page. It's an obituary for Cordelia Lancaster. She passed away just 3 months ago. Garrett's face fell. We're too late. Whatever she wanted to tell me, she took it to her grave. But Zane wasn't ready to give up. Maybe not. Look, it says she's survived by a daughter, Vivian, my cousin. I barely remember her, but if anyone knows what Aunt Cordelia wanted to tell you, it would be her. With renewed purpose, they set out to track down Vivian Lancaster. It took several days of asking around town and following leads, but they finally obtained an address for a small bookshop on the outskirts of Millbrook. The bell above the door jingled as Zane and Garrett entered Turning Pages, a cozy bookstore filled with the scent of old paper and leather. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening in recognition. Uncle Garrett? Zane? Is that really you? Vivian asked, her voice a mix of surprise and wariness. Zane stepped forward, offering a tentative smile. Hi, Vivian. It's been a long time. Vivian came around the counter, her gaze shifting between father and son. What are you doing here after all these years, all? Garrett cleared his throat nervously. Vivian, I know this must be a shock. I've recently returned to Millbrook. There are things I need to make right, and I was hoping to speak with your mother. But we just learned of her passing. I'm so sorry for your loss. Vivian's expression hardened. Are you? You disappeared for decades, Uncle Garrett. Do you have any idea what that did to this family? Zane interceded, sensing the rising tension. Vivian, we're not here to cause trouble. We're trying to understand some things about the past. Your mother wrote to my dad asking him to come back. She said she had something important to tell him about my mom. Do you know what that might have been? Vivian's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a look of uncertainty. Mom never told me the details. She just said there were secrets in the family, things that needed to come to light. But she was ill for a long time before she died, and sometimes her mind would wander. I'm not sure how much of what she said was real and how much was confusion. Garrett leaned forward, his voice urgent. Please, Vivian, if there's anything you can tell us, anything at all, it would mean so much. Vivian hesitated, then sighed. Look, I don't know much, but Mom left a box of old papers and photos. She said if you ever came back, I should give it to you. I always thought she was just holding on to false hope, but, well, here you are. She disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a battered shoebox. Here, she said, handing it to Garrett. Whatever answers you're looking for, I hope you find them in there. As Garrett took the box, his hands shaking slightly, Zane couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. What secrets did this box hold? And how would they change the fragile new relationship he was building with his father? Vivian watched them with a guarded expression. I don't know what you'll find in there, but be careful. Sometimes the past is better left buried. With those ominous words hanging in the air, Zane and Garrett thanked Vivian and left the bookshop. As they walked back to their warehouse home, the weight of the shoebox seemed to grow heavier with each step. That night they sat on the floor of the warehouse, The contents of the box spread out before them. Faded photographs, old letters, and documents yellowed with age lay scattered around them. As they sifted through the memories and secrets of their family's past, neither Zane nor Garrett could shake the feeling that they were on the brink of a revelation that would change everything, for better or worse. The truth was about to come to light. The soft glow of a salvaged lamp cast long shadows across the warehouse floor as Zane and Garrett pored over the contents of Aunt Cordelia's box. Faded photographs brought bittersweet smiles to their faces, images of happier times, of a family whole and unbroken. But it was the stack of letters bound together with a faded ribbon that held the promise of answers. Garrett's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. "These are letters from your mother," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "To Cordelia. They span years right up until—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Zane leaned in, his heart racing. "What do they say, Dad?" As Garrett began to read, his face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, shock, anger, and finally, a deep, overwhelming sadness. When he looked up at Zane, there were tears in his eyes. "Zane, I don't know how to tell you this," Garrett began, his voice barely above a whisper. "According to these letters, I'm not your biological father." The words hit Zane like a physical blow. He recoiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "What? No, that can't be right. There must be some mistake." Garrett handed him the letters with shaking hands. "Read them yourself. Your mother, she had an affair before we were married. She found out she was pregnant, but she was scared and alone. I had been her friend for years, and when I proposed, she saw it as a way out of her situation. She thought she was doing the right thing, giving you a stable home." Zane's mind reeled as he scanned the letters, his mother's familiar handwriting blurring before his eyes. The truth was there, in black and white, a secret she had carried for years, confiding only in her sister. "Did you know?" Zane asked, his voice hollow. "All those years ago, did you find out? Is that why you left?" Garrett shook his head vehemently. "No, Zane, I swear to you I had no idea. If I had known, God, I don't know what I would have done. But I wouldn't have left you. You were my son, biology be damned." A bitter laugh escaped Zane's lips. "But you did leave, and now you're telling me you're not even really my father? What am I supposed to do with this?" Garrett reached out, hesitating before placing a hand on Zane's shoulder. "Listen to me. I made a terrible mistake when I left. But you are my son, Zane. In every way that matters. These past weeks, getting to know you as a man, it's only made me more certain of that. I love you, and I'm so proud of the person you've become despite everything." Zane wanted to pull away, to run from this new reality. But something in his father's, no, in Garrett's eyes held him there. The genuine remorse, the love he saw there, it was real. More real than any DNA test could ever be. "I don't know how to process this," Zane admitted, his anger giving way to a bone-deep weariness. "All my life I thought I knew who I was, where I came from. And now—" Garrett squeezed his shoulder gently. "I know. And I'm so sorry that this has upended your world once again. But Zane, this doesn't change who you are. You're still the same strong, compassionate man you were yesterday, the same man who took in a confused old stranger and helped him find his way back to himself." As the night wore on, they continued to go through the box, piecing together the story of Elaine's secret and the years that followed. There were more letters, some from Elaine to Cordelia, expressing her guilt and fear of discovery, and others from Cordelia to Garrett, written after Elaine's death but never sent. In one of the final letters, dated just weeks before Cordelia's own passing, she wrote, "Garrett, I've carried this secret for too long, and I fear I'm running out of time to make things right. Elaine made me promise never to tell, but I can't go to my grave with this burden. You deserve to know the truth about Zane, and he deserves to know about his heritage. I don't know if you'll ever read this, if you'll ever come back to Millbrook, but if you do, please find Zane. He's grown into a fine young man despite all the hardships he's faced. He needs his father. the man who raised him, who loved him from the moment he was born. It's time for the lies and secrets to end. It's time for healing to begin. Cordelia. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the warehouse windows, Zane and Garrett sat in exhausted silence. The revelations of the night had shaken them both to their core, but in the quiet of the morning, a strange sense of peace began to settle over them. Zane looked at Garrett, the man who had chosen to be his father, who had loved him as his own despite everything. "So," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "where do we go from here?" Garrett met his gaze steadily. "That's up to you, son. I meant what I said. You are my child, in every way that counts. If you'll have me, I want to be part of your life, to try and make up for all the years we've lost." Zane was quiet for a long moment, weighing the pain of the past against the possibility of a future with the father he'd longed for all these years. Finally, he nodded. I think I'd like that. It won't be easy, and we have a lot to work through, but maybe this is our chance to start over, to build something real." As they began to clean up the scattered papers and photos, a small envelope fell from between the pages of an old book. Zane picked it up, his breath catching as he read the name on the front. "To my son, Zane." With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. His mother's handwriting, so familiar and yet now laden with new meaning, flowed across the page. "My dearest Zane, if you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light. I'm so sorry for the pain and confusion this must be causing you. Please know that everything I did out of love for you. Your father, and I mean Garrett, the man who raised you, is a good man. He loved you from the moment he laid eyes on you, and that love was real and true. The circumstances of your birth don't change that. I hope that someday you can forgive me for my deception, and I hope that you and Garrett can find your way back to each other. You both deserve happiness and love. Remember, my sweet boy, you are the best of me. Your strength, your kindness, your resilient spirit. These are the things that truly define you, not the secrets of the past, but the choices you make and the love you give. I love you, always and forever. Mom." As Zane finished reading, tears streaming down his face, he felt Garrett's arm wrap around his shoulders. Together, father and son held on to each other, finding strength in their shared grief, their shared love, and the promise of a new beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but as the morning sun bathed the warehouse in golden light, both Zane and Garrett felt a spark of hope. They had found each other against all odds, had weathered the storm of truth, and now, finally, they had the chance to build the relationship they had both longed for. As they stepped out into the new day, they were no longer just a homeless young man and a lost, confused stranger. They were family, bound not by blood but by choice, by love, and by the unbreakable bonds of the heart. In the months that followed the revelations from Aunt Cordelia's box, Zane and Garrett embarked on a journey of healing and reconciliation. The truth about Zane's biological parentage had been a shock, but it also served as a catalyst for honest conversations and deeper understanding between father and son. As winter gave way to spring in Millbrook, Zane and Garrett worked tirelessly to rebuild their lives. With Garrett's Social Security benefits reinstated and Zane picking up odd jobs around town, they were able to rent a small, modest apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a far cry from the abandoned warehouse they had called home. One sunny afternoon, as they were settling into their new place, Garrett broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "Zane," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking, have you ever considered trying to find your biological father?" Zane paused in the middle of unpacking a box, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, not really. I mean, I'm curious, of course, but..." He looked at Garrett, his eyes full of emotion. "You're my dad. Biology doesn't change that." Garrett felt a warmth spread through his chest at Zane's words. "I appreciate that, son, more than you know. But I want you to know that if you ever do want to search for him, I'll support you. You deserve to know your full history." Zane nodded, touched by Garrett's selflessness. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe someday. But for now, I'm just happy to have you back in my life." As they continued to settle into their new home and routine, both men found themselves on paths of personal growth. Garrett, determined to make amends for his past mistakes, began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. The road to sobriety was challenging, but with Zane's unwavering support, he found the strength to face each day. Zane, inspired by his father's efforts, decided it was time to pursue his own dreams. He enrolled in night classes at the local community college, studying social work. His experiences on the streets had given him a unique perspective, and he was determined to use that knowledge to help others in similar situations. Their newfound stability also allowed them to reconnect with other parts of their past. Vivian, initially wary of her long-lost uncle and cousin, gradually warmed to them. Sunday dinners at her bookshop became a weekly tradition, filled with laughter, stories, and the gentle healing of old wounds. As months turned into a year, the changes in both Zane and Garrett were remarkable. Garrett, sober and clear-eyed, had regained much of his vigor. He volunteered at a local senior center, finding purpose in helping others navigate the challenges of aging. Zane, now in his second semester of college, thrived in his studies and had started an internship at a homeless outreach program. Their apartment, once bare and impersonal, had become a true home. Photos of Elaine sat alongside new memories they were creating together. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined them. One evening, as they sat on their small balcony watching the sunset, Garrett turned to Zane with a smile. "You know, son, I never thought I'd have this again. A home, a family, hope for the future. I can't thank you enough for giving me a second chance." Zane reached out and squeezed his father's hand. "We gave each other a second chance, Dad, and I'm grateful for it every day." As the golden light of the setting sun bathed them in its warm glow, both men felt a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. They had weathered storms of loss, betrayal, and painful truths, but had emerged stronger, their bond tested and proven unbreakable. The story of Zane and Garrett Holloway was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more growth to experience, but they would face it all together, as father and son, bound not by blood, but by choice and love. As night fell over Millbrook, stars twinkling to life in the darkening sky, Zane and Garrett sat in comfortable silence. They didn't need words to express the gratitude they felt for this unexpected second chance at family, for the twist of fate that had brought them back together. In that moment, on a small balcony in a modest apartment, two men who had once been lost to each other found themselves exactly where they were meant to be. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility, a new chapter waiting to be written. And as they looked out over the town that had witnessed their separation and reunion, both Zane and Garrett knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever life had in store for them, they would face it side by side, their bond stronger than any secret, any mistake, any twist of fate. The end of one journey had become the beginning of another, and for the first time in years, both father and son looked to the future not with fear or regret, but with hope, love, and the unshakable knowledge that they were, and always would be, family.